This is the first time that I've been up here doing one of these events with a mask on, but I can hear myself through the PA system, so I guess we're okay. Just wanted to welcome you guys here, and whoever is watching, I assume this is streamed, yes, on our, okay, that's what I thought. I'm Dick Polman, and I teach, excuse me, I teach journalism in the writing program here, and have these events every semester. And I just wanted to say hello to everybody here and thank the Writers House for continuing through this crazy period that we're living in to host these events, and hoping, of course, that at some point soon we'll be able to do this with our full faces once more. So I wanted to have a conversation with our guest today. Our guest has been an Philadelphia Inquirer reporter since 2017 and has specialized heavily in covering some of the more serious issues that befall our city, most particularly gun violence and issues with the police and police brutality. Not easy stuff to cover, takes a lot of perseverance, and we're going to be hearing a lot about that today. So please welcome Anna Orso. I want to just ask a few questions, and at some point, 20 minutes in, thereabouts, I'm going to hopefully have you guys lob them up here, because I know you can probably ask better questions than I can. But I wanted to basically just start, just as by way of introduction. And as you graduated Penn State. Yep.
I did. Sorry to say. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here at Penn, and thanks to the Writers House for hosting. I'm excited to talk to you, Dick, because I've admired you for a long time. So happy to be here.
Thank you.
Yes, I grew up in York, Pennsylvania, and majored in print journalism at Penn State.
So did you ever have classes with Gene Foreman?
He was actually retired by the time that I
okay.
got
See,
there.
I'm old.
But he did edit a story that I wrote for a long-form journalism class.
Gene Foreman was the second in command at the Philadelphia Inquirer for a very long time, then taught at Penn State for years. So what I actually wanted to, here's something that, I don't know, this might be relatable to some of you here. When did you, at what age, and in what way did you first, I don't know, get bitten by a journalism bug or have a sense that you wanted to be able to write or find things out and tell people about them, the basics of reporting? When did you first get that glimmer?
So for me, it was actually in high school. When I was a junior, we had an elective in my high school called journalism. And I wanted to take the class because it was closest to the lunchroom, so I would be first in line for lunch. But I just fell in love with journalism, and after a week in the class, I was just hooked. And we had a school paper. I pretty much knew from that point on that I wanted to major in journalism and be a journalist.
So what was it, though? What was it about, what was it that hooked you? What aspect of it? Was it communicating with other people about what you were finding out? Or was it, you just realized you had an ability to write?
For me, I always enjoyed writing. I never really thought of a way that I could make a career out of it, which sounds a little ridiculous now. But what I really loved about journalism was talking to people. I loved talking to I loved permission to ask ridiculous questions of people I went to school with.
Okay, such as?
I just liked being able to pry a little bit, ask people questions that maybe you wouldn't normally. I liked writing profiles. I liked really digging in on people's personalities and how they grew up and what their background was. So I just felt like it was a fun opportunity to be nosy and write.
So, all right, so at Penn State, and you were on the college paper, or you were the editor of the college paper?
Yes, I was the managing editor of the Daily Collegian my junior year at Penn State. Yeah.
Okay. Was there? Yeah. And so between the newspaper, the college paper, and the classes that you took, what would you say was? This may be hard to just single out something, but maybe there's a few things. The things that perhaps you most remember about either what you experienced or what you were taught that you think are still perhaps relevant today or resonate with you today?
Oh gosh. Well, I had kind of a bizarre college experience because when I was reporting at the Daily Collegian, the Jerry Sandusky scandal broke,
Oh, that's
and
right.
I was the cops reporter at the time, so I was covering, the whole scandal. And then when I was a senior, I decided I wanted to cover football for some reason, and so my experience was really sort of atypical. I saw myself as a real working journalist when I was in college. And in some ways, a lot of my classes came second, and I probably shouldn't admit that here at Penn, but they did. And I learned how newsrooms operate. I learned how to collaborate, and I got really used to calling people up and asking them uncomfortable questions, which is something that takes a lot of practice and that I still get nervous about today. But for me, a lot of my experience was just getting practice, getting reps in sort of the reporting arena. And I think the writing sort of fell into place just with that practice.
Is everybody here familiar with reference to the Jerry Sandusky scandal? Everybody know what that is or need to know? Few of you do. So just fill in on that, because
Yeah.
I mean that's important. In other words, the idea that one of the first things that got you interested was something that actually the scandal had national implications. So it wasn't just a local story. So for those here who don't know.
Yeah. So what happened was there was a explosive grand jury presentment that came out, and charges were filed against a former defensive coordinator at Penn State named Jerry Sandusky. He was accused of grooming and sexually assaulting 10 young boys that he had met through a nonprofit that he had founded for children. And then after that, Penn State's president and its longtime football coach, Joe Paterno, were implicated. Both of them were fired. The president was criminally charged for covering up child sex abuse, as were two other officials. This was a massive national story, and I was 19 years old and literally reporting next to people from CNN. So actually, a part of me always worried that my career peaked when I was 19. But it was just a huge opportunity and really sort of, I think, changed the course of my career.
Oh, yeah. I mean, was there any one particular piece that you wrote that you think had the, I don't know, either the biggest impact with an audience or had the biggest impact with you personally within that scandal?
Frankly, a lot of it was just breaking news. So it was really just trying to keep up. After I worked with another reporter, and we wrote kind of like the first big story where we just went really in depth on what was alleged in the grand jury presentment, what Sandusky was alleged to have done and how the school responded. We really saw it as our job as the college paper to tell students this is how Penn State handled this. Yes, the criminal charges were important, but more importantly was, did your school fail to do the right thing in both a legal and a moral sense? And so I think that was a perspective that we tried to keep throughout this multiple year-long saga.
Yeah. So, all right. So and then you did some, you had some internships and stuff in Pittsburgh and Harrisburg.
Correct.
Right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So, how did you gravitate, or how did you come to Philadelphia? Some of you may be familiar with this. There's a website still here, right? Called Billy Penn, which offers a lot of, young aspiring journalists the opportunity to write and report.
Yes.
So is that how you hooked up with them somewhere around 2014-ish?
Correct.
Somewhere in there?
Yeah. So
Okay.
my first job after college was at the Patriot News in Harrisburg, where I was kind of a general assignment crime reporter. Frankly, I had a lot of friends living in Philadelphia. My dad lived here growing up, so I was familiar with the city, had some connection to it. I love American history, and so that always attracted me to the city. It was really just a great opportunity to come to Billy Penn. It was a brand new news organization at the time. I was the first reporter hired to work there. And they put out a call they said they were looking for some reporters to work for this new organization that was going to try to do a lot of innovative work online and in the digital space. And frankly, our goal was to really give the Inquirer a run for its money and see if we could peel away some younger readers, attract more women, attract more people of color, and just go at the news in a way that was completely different and sort of fresh. And I kind of jumped at the opportunity.
Right. But then you ended up at the Inquirer.
I know.
Because they wanted to sort of absorb the kind of expertise that Billy Penn was doing to attract younger readers.
Exactly. And I always respected the Inquirer. It was never that I had anything against the Inquirer. I just thought that there were ways that it could improve. And I in many ways was hired to do what I did at Billy Penn, which was be a little more edgy, write bold headlines. So that's why my first job was actually on the features desk at the Inquirer. I was trying to bring in more younger female readers in particular.
All right. So what attracted you? I mean, one of the reasons that we're here talking now is a lot of the stuff that, has really rocked the city has been the ratcheted up gun violence, the protests and the police reaction to the protests, and the pressures also that the police, at least from their perspective, feel that they're under, trying to be the thin blue line and all that. How did you gravitate toward writing those stories? Is it because you just instinctively felt that they were the most urgent things going on, or just the most sort of dramatically compelling for you personally? I don't want to put words in your mouth on that.
No, there's a couple of reasons. I was always interested in crime. I minored in criminology, so I have always had a sort of weird attraction to the criminal justice system and been interested in those issues. But for me, a lot of it was that I have been really critical of how the Inquirer covered gun violence and criminal justice in the past. No one person in particular, but I have said, I think there's a better way to do this. I think that we can humanize these stories in a different way. And finally, I was kind of maybe instead of sitting around criticizing how everybody else is doing it, maybe I should give it a try. And I learned that covering gun violence is way easier to criticize than it is to cover. And we can get into that more. But yeah, a lot of it was that I thought that I could try a new way to cover it.
Okay. Well, that's worth getting into for sure. What was the more sort of, from your perspective, what was the more traditional way that the Inquirer was covering the gun violence in the city that you thought was lacked a very key element? And what was it then that you wanted to bring to it and presumably have?
I think that a lot of times when we look at the Inquirer's coverage of gun violence over time, it has focused heavily on telling the stories of people who, quote unquote, weren't supposed to be shot, telling the sort of stories that shock the conscience, the stories about shootings that happen in Center City, shootings that happen near City Hall, shootings that happen near Penn. And, to me, the real tragedy often is that there are families being destroyed by this every single day across the city whose stories we weren't telling, in my opinion, to the best of our ability. Like I said, it varies from person to person. Helen Ubenius has done an amazing job covering gun violence in the city for a long time, but she's a columnist, and so she can have a certain voice that reporters don't often have. And so I wanted to sort of bring her flavor for being able to humanize these stories to a rigorous, reporting standard, and to come from a place of objectivity, but also from a place of empathy. And in many ways, I think that I succeeded, and in many ways, I think that I failed. And so that's the cool thing about journalism, is we get to try again every day. So, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
In part, I was attracted to it because I was critical of it. We'll leave it there.
All right. So two of the examples. I mean, this is something I've been sharing with the class. Two of the examples are the piece you did about this woman who was after one of the protests, was just driving through West Philadelphia, I believe, with her 2-year-old in the car and her 16-year-old nephew. And the cops pulled her out of the car, and she was beaten, and she got separated from her 2-year-old and didn't know where he was or who had him. And the nephew was hospitalized. So following that through from the perspective of the woman, and her name is Rakia?
Rakia Young.
Rakia Young, right. So following the story through the perspective of her, and using the example of her telling the story through this person, telling the larger story in effect of what happens when the police have excesses and how they don't necessarily hold themselves accountable with any deliberate speed. So the other story, just as another example, is the other one I just mentioned that I shared, which was a woman in Germantown neighborhood leaving for work, and some stranger comes up and shoots her in the face, which was your lead of the story. And so following that through about how she has tried to sort of deal with that, and they never found the assailant. So I guess one question that some people would have, younger people in particular, would be how do you, on this beat, as it were, how do you first hear about these things? All right, so this is one woman and then one woman. How do you hear about them? Are these like you get posted on social media that you're watching, or do you hear about it second? I mean, I know it's probably different for every story, but those as examples would be interesting to hear.
And actually, those are two great examples because I got those stories in two completely different ways. So for the Rakia Young story, she was the woman who was driving not far from here at 52nd and Market after Walter Wallace was killed. That story bubbled up because there was a video that circulated online hours after it happened, showing about 24 police officers surrounding an SUV, pulling out the driver and the passenger, beating them with batons, bashing in the windows, and then pulling out from the backseat what appeared to be a child. And that's all that we knew at the time. And I remember our managing editor put it in Slack, which is our internal communication network, and he said, we need to find out if this is real, because if this is real, it's a story. So I, through some sort of weird Twitter and Instagram work, found the person who took the video originally, got in touch with her, and just published a story that this happened. We still didn't know who the driver was. And then, lo and behold, after we published that story, I heard from a relative of the driver, and she said, "This is my relative," and so that's kind of how I initially got in touch with Rakia Young. And stemming from, I did a couple breaking news stories, and then I got her to do an interview, and about a month later, published a really long piece on her and everything that she went through. She recently settled with the city for $2 million. The second story about Evelyn was totally different. That was actually found by the photographer that I worked with, whose name is Jessica Griffin. She's a phenomenal photojournalist. And she had developed relationships with victims advocates in the city. And because she knew that she wanted to photograph gun violence survivors. And so a great victims advocate in Northwest Philly said, I have the perfect person for you. She's a gregarious 63-year-old named Evelyn, and she would be perfect for this. And so that's just how we met her. It was just through sort of, run-of-the-mill source relationships.
Do you guys have questions? Because I don't like to go more than 20 minutes on my own ruminations here. Since we're getting into some good specific stuff, any of you guys just want to throw questions at us, I can pause in my own stuff and come back to it. I'm more than happy to do that. Anybody going once, going twice for now? Think it out, because I will come back to you guys again. So actually, when you mentioned the photographer, who took a lot of those pictures, at least on one of the stories.
On all four of them.
All right,
Yeah.
There's kind of a, maybe I'm talking from the old school here, very possibly. But it used to be that a lot of reporters did not like it when photographers were kind of tagging along with them or working closely on a story for two reasons. One would be, and I used to hear this all the time, the photographer is going to, kind of upset the balance, the sensitive balance that you're trying to communicate with sources and stuff if they're there with a camera. And the other reason would be if a lot of photographs run with a story, it's going to detract from the words and from what the writer is writing. Now I may be way talking about the distant past. I have a feeling, because I think now in terms of multiple platforms that writing is only considered maybe in a presentation only one of the tools now, that you have to have the video, you have to have visuals. Can you speak on that, Amon?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that that's necessarily like an old school sort of way of thinking. I think that it can vary from person to person. I have a deep appreciation for photography for the sole reason that my mother is a photographer. And so, photojournalism is deeply important to me. And I really see the value in it. I also think that for many of us who are digital natives, we know that we're not going to click on a story if it has a terrible photograph. Like, if I see a story on Facebook and the photo's ugly, I'm not going to click on it. So, I feel strongly that the better photojournalist, that I'm working with, the better the story is going to turn out, the more eyeballs are going to get on the story. And, in the case of working with someone like Jessica, who I worked on with this series that I did on gun violence survivors, we ended up writing 4 different stories. And, she is kind of like a reporter. She did a lot of reporting, and, I just really liked collaborating with her. I always felt like she was respectful of the sources, and I kind of feel like if somebody's comfortable being photographed all the time, they're definitely comfortable talking. So once you sort of break through that barrier and spend a lot of time with somebody, I think that it's only mutually beneficial to the writer and the photographer.
Anybody have any thought? Any DP people have thoughts about any of that? I was just curious also about the police themselves. How hard are they to deal with in Philadelphia? I mean, if you've got a sensitive story, and I could tell from, some of the reactions that or the lack of comment that you had to sort of note in at least one of these stories, the brutality story, that you're calling up people. It's a bureaucratic system for sure. Is it hard to get the answers you're looking for? How persistent you have to be? I mean, how do you manage that relationship, if I can call it that?
Yeah. For me, I see the police department in many ways as what they are, which is a sort of government entity. And like any government agency, like City Hall or like, certain legislators' offices in Harrisburg, it depends who you're talking to and when it comes to how helpful they'll be. The police department has an entire public relations apparatus, so they respond quickly when we have questions about something that's happening for the most part. But when it's something that is going to make them look not so great, it can absolutely be challenging to get answers. A lot of times they prefer that we put our questions in writing and then they respond in writing, which is obviously not ideal. In an ideal world, I could have a phone call with the police commissioner and ask her questions about an incident, or with a police captain or something like that. And we can have a conversation, we can have a back and forth, and we can have a better sense of understanding. But it's getting increasingly common, I think, for all government agencies to prefer that you put your questions in writing and then they respond in writing. And, for me, I think that that's not the ideal way to extract information. But it gives them a good opportunity to dodge the question and to really think about their answer and to have lawyers look at it. And the answer to your question is yes, it's hard, and it's even harder when the story will make them look not so great.
Yeah, I guess the problem with written questions is you don't get to, you can't do follow-ups, in real time. You can't just say, well, when you just said blah, 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 parsing what you just said, are you really saying this? So yeah, there's no follow-ups. Of course, I guess, and then it puts a lot more pressure on the reporter to try to craft questions that allow for absolutely no wiggle room whatsoever, but they still find it? Am I in the right ballpark here?
Yeah, when they ask me to write down questions, I try to ask yes or no questions because I don't really want to leave something up for interpretation. But yes, they always find ways to wiggle around it. And, not only can I not ask a follow-up question, I can't fact check them. I can't say, no, actually, I know that to be wrong because I've already interviewed person A, B, and C. So why does their account differ from your account? You can't do that when you're on a deadline and they respond to you 20 minutes before your deadline because they know that we operate on deadlines. And so, yeah, it's not good for transparency. I will say there are plenty of well-meaning people in the police department who have developed great relationships with myself and a lot of other reporters from the Inquirer, and there are many people in the department who want information to be made available and want to have a better, stronger relationship with the public. And so I'm not here to say that this is every member of the police department.
Right. Actually, and that tees up what I was going to ask you anyway about nurturing individual sources within the department, and how that has worked in practice for you. Because obviously then, you might have people who can just sort of, steer you toward things that, hey, you should be asking about this or asking about that. How does one go about nurturing sources, and can you give kind of an example without blowing anybody's cover, of course?
Oh, sure. I'll just be frank. Like, I've only been covering the department for less than, and I am not solely covering the department, but for less than a year. So that might sound like a lot of time, but it's not a lot of time to really cultivate sources, especially in the police department, which can in some ways be sort of impenetrable. I think that people are afraid of making relationships with Inquirer reporters. We have run a lot of pieces in the last few years that have been very critical of them. My colleague Samantha Malamed did an excellent series called The Homicide Files, which was extremely critical of the homicide department at the police department. And so I think that a lot of people are nervous. But what I try to do is I try to show, especially neighborhood level captains, that I really care about what's going on in their district. So there are a couple dozen districts across the city. They're all responsible for safety in one neighborhood. And I try to say, look, I'm not trying to get anything out of you. Tell me what is the biggest problem in your neighborhood, and do people know about it? And what could be done to fix it? And I think that really goes a long way in showing these police captains that I'm not actually out to get you. I care about your community in a different way than you do, and I want to know how we can in some ways work together to craft a better understanding. So it can certainly be a challenge, but I think that it comes down to developing sources like anybody else. You don't want to just go to somebody when you need information from them urgently. You want to build relationships and go to them on a more regular basis.
Now, there's more women in the department than there used to be, no doubt. Mm-hmm. Is it easier, typically speaking, is it easier to cultivate sources with the women in the department as a woman?
Good question. That's a really good question. I don't know that that's the case. I think that there are certainly things that we can bond over. We can bond over being women in sort of traditionally male-dominated spaces. No, I'd say the women in the department can be equally hard to deal with. I don't know. I think it really does vary from person to person. And in some ways, it depends on their own personal values too, and how much they value information.
This is partly a rhetorical question, but is it valuable for a reporter to just basically become, let's say, to toughen one's hide, because a lot of times you're just banging your head against the wall, the bureaucratic wall. Is toughening one's hide a prerequisite for being a successful reporter? in this
Yes.
in the kind of stuff that you do, especially, I'm thinking.
Yes, for a variety of reasons. And I don't know that dealing with the bureaucracy is actually the hardest part or the most frustrating part. I mean, we're operating in an environment here in Philadelphia where criminal justice is very political. Gun violence is very political. You know, Larry Krasner, Jim Kenney, the police department, all these different entities have varying levels of cooperation with each other. You know, they have well-documented arguments with each other in public. And because of that, tensions are very inflamed. And people on social media often, you know, for lack of a better term, shoot the messenger. And, you know, I think that that's another way that, like, we have to be able to just let that sort of roll off of us, because we're serving a bigger purpose here, and it's not to, like, deal with trolls on Twitter who think that I am, you know, on one side or the other.
So do you get a lot of heat on Twitter, you yourself?
Yeah. Oh, and I you know, I was used to that because I covered Penn State, and Penn State fans, sports fans, are
That's right.
sports fans, and in some ways more passionate than people are about politics. So, you know, it's something that I've become increasingly used to, which is kind of sad, but never really comfortable with. And, you know, I don't know that we should be, but it's something that I've tried to learn to sort of, like I said, let roll off me and remember that I'm serving readers and the city and, in a lot of ways, the people that I'm writing about, and not the people who are bored and have something to say.
Well, social media at this point, you know, it's kind of hard to, despite its excesses or whatever, it's kind of hard to ignore. I mean, if it's giving you, you know, you can get some tips for stories from it. I mean, I'm just wondering, you know, when you get up in the morning, how quickly do you grab your phone and start scrolling?
The moment I wake up.
Okay, it's probably no different from most people here, but you know, in your case, all right, explain further. What are you looking for, and where do you look for it?
Well, I mean, I think like any reporter, I'm in part just like addicted to the news. So whatever's going on, I want to know immediately. But, you know, yeah, I get a ton of stories from Twitter. I am increasingly getting a ton of stories from Instagram, which I think is where a lot of people are talking about gun violence in particular, and where I find a lot more sort of human sources. Twitter has in some ways become like an echo chamber of like journalists, elites, and like a little circle of like trolls. And I think that Instagram is actually a better way to find people who have been impacted by certain issues. But point is, like, social media is a huge, huge, huge helpful tool for me, and it's where I find a ton of stories, and so it's essential.
Well, there's one of these was one of those.
Exactly.
You guys have any questions? Anybody? There's one. Oh yeah, we got a mic. That just also helps for the streaming.
Okay. I want to go back to something that you said kind of earlier on about just like building trust with sources.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, like, it's very different to build trust with like the police department versus the victims of police brutality or gun violence. And at least to me, it feels easy to say, like, obviously you want to treat your sources with empathy, but in practice, what does that mean? And how do you build those relationships as you're speaking to people in possibly like one of the worst moments of their life?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. A couple of things come to mind. First of all, I have learned over time that I think that the best way to communicate with a source is to be as honest as possible about what I'm doing. Before I start an interview, I tell the source, you know, what to expect. You know, I don't say, here's the questions that I'm going to ask, but I say, okay, first we're going to sort of talk about you. Then we're going to talk about what happened, and I know it'll be uncomfortable. Let me know if you want to take a break. And then I ask them if they have any questions for me. And I have found that that is like the number one thing that just disarms people and makes people feel like they're playing a part in the process, and like I'm not just bombarding them for information on the worst day of their life. So I like to sort of practice transparency and honesty with people who I'm speaking with. But you know, in reality, like the biggest thing is spending time with people. We spent just many, many, many hours with people who I wrote these profiles about survivors of gun violence, and we must have interviewed Evelyn 7, 8, 9 times. I mean, I literally just texted her this morning because I got a letter from some reader, and the story ran 6 months ago, and I needed to send it to her. We communicate often. So it's really about finding a person who will trust you enough to let you keep coming back to them over and over and over again, and trying to best understand their personality and their story. And you'll always get a richer and better story the more you get to know a person, because in my opinion, the more you get to know a person, the more you're removing yourself from the story, and the story is just about them. I don't know if that answers your question. It was a little rambly.
Well, yeah, just to actually follow on that question, do you basically, what you say, you want to be transparent, but do you go on the record with them right away, or do you, it may not be either or in some circumstances, do you just sort of say, because this is what I used to do, let's just talk for a while, and, you know, you may see me write some stuff down or whatever, but when we really get to it, you know, we'll get to it, but let's just talk for a while just to get you comfortable.
That's almost always what I do. I mean, if I have
okay.
time, if I'm covering something where I'm on deadline,
Yeah, well,
so
that's
I have to
different.
file a story that day, I often have less time with people, and, you know, we just get right into it. But if it's somebody who I'm going to be writing a big story about, I almost always talk to them on what I call on background.
Right.
So we just talk, I'll take some notes, but they feel much more comfortable feeling like they're not going to be quoted, you know, right off the bat. And yeah, so that's what I do too, and I think it makes people really comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I just found some people, sometimes if you move it too quickly to that point, sometimes they're still nervous and they'll say things, and then they'll say, you know, but don't use that. And it could be something when they're more comfortable that they'd be fine that you'd use it, but right off the bat, sometimes they don't.
Exactly.
And you don't want that impediment to be there. Other questions?
Thanks so much. Given that social media literacy and like being able to use the internet as a tool are like really crucial skills for reporting, how do you work to sort of develop those skills and maximize the information that you're taking out of those platforms without necessarily like getting swept up in all of the like online discourse that it's really easy to like have dominating your feed?
That's another really good question. So to be honest with you, like I have in some cases actually not even shared stories that I've written on my Twitter because I know that they're going to cause people to be upset. So I have become increasingly judicious about what I do share on Twitter specifically, you know, in the last few years. I would say 5 years ago, I shared everything I wrote. I shared everything my colleagues wrote. I shared a lot about myself. And I have become a lot more specific about what I choose to share. I still try to have personality on Twitter. I had a great conversation 2 nights ago. I asked my followers, my parents are coming into town. Where should I take them? I need somewhere that's like not hip or loud. And we had a great conversation, and that has nothing to do with my beat. It makes people realize that like I'm a real person. My parents are also coming into town. And I think that it builds trust with readers in a way that's really powerful. But you know, then like it is weird to sort of code switch a little bit and then go to like, and here's a story that I wrote about something very, very upsetting that happened to someone in this city. And it can be a challenging balance for sure. I think that I have learned to err on the side of if you're questioning whether or not you should post it, don't post it. Always, you'll never regret not posting it.
More questions?
Thanks. Earlier, before you started the conversation about the police, you mentioned having reading between the lines in an article to make a guess. So I'm guessing as a journalist, you read the news very differently, and I'm wondering what kinds of reading between the lines do you do, and how do you read a news article looking for different things to draw out something that might be missed by a less savvy reader of the news?
Interesting. I think that as a journalist, when I read the news, if the sourcing isn't clear, I'm always trying to figure out what it is, because again, I'm nosy like that. My goal in my reporting is that I don't ever want somebody to have to read between the lines. I want somebody to read my story, and if I can't disclose my source, they know that it's, coming from something credible, and they're understanding why I'm not disclosing my source. So while, yes, oftentimes in news, you do have to try to do a little guesswork about where the information came from, my goal is, and I think the goal of most journalists, is for that to actually not be the case, for us to be as transparent as possible. And, look, I don't really use anonymous sources all that much. I mean, the vast majority of my stories, yes, there's information and sort of institutional knowledge that I bring to it from talking to sources who don't go on the record. But the vast majority of my sources are fully on the record with their full names, often with their pictures, because I think that it's important to show the readers our work and show them, in this day and age when nobody trusts the press, I think it's important to show people, I actually went out and did the work and I talked to this person, and this is a real person, not just somebody who you may or may not believe them to be real. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but, I would prefer that most journalism, you don't have to read between any lines.
Yeah. The problem is that sometimes there's these compromises that get made sometimes between people who have something they want to give you, and you can check it out to see if it's right, but they also want to stay as far off the firing line as possible. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes you have to make, choices.
Yeah. And I think that's where documents can come in handy a lot is, a really good reporter once told me, when somebody tells you information and they don't want to talk about it, your first question should be, where is this written down? And I think about that all the time, because oftentimes if somebody doesn't want to talk, they know where I might be able to get an email or even a public record or a court filing or something like that, where I might be able to tell the same story and source a piece of paper as opposed to a person.
Other questions? I wanted to roll back on something you said about your parents coming to town. If I can ask this particular question.
Sure.
They know what you do. I'm sure they're very proud of you and stuff. Are they ever worried that you're going into mean streets, and I don't, you don't have to necessarily say what you tell them, share what you tell them. It leads me to the question I was going to ask anyway, which is that as a woman, also especially in the mean streets of Philadelphia, are there personal steps that you take to ensure your own safety?
Yes, my parents worry about me all the time, but they would worry about me all the time no matter what I was covering. And, I'll tell you guys what I tell them, because there's a few answers to this question. I think the most important thing to keeping myself, in check and aware is understanding why I am in a neighborhood. In most of the neighborhoods where I'm writing about gun violence, I am coming in as a middle-class white woman who lives not that far from Center City, and I am not from their community. I'm going into majority black neighborhoods, and people have good reason not to trust me. And I try to see myself as a guest in their community, as somebody who's there because I'm trying to learn more about their community. And sometimes people don't want to invite me, and that's fine, because there are plenty of people who do. So I think in part it's remembering why I'm there gives me a level of comfort. that I don't know that I would have if I saw myself as somebody who was just parachuting into a neighborhood I don't really want to be in, and seeing it as this, like, you know, terrible place, when really these are very rich, vibrant communities. As far as safety is concerned, I mean, again, like anything else, it comes with practice. I'm always aware of what I am not aware of, if that makes sense. I try to remember that, I don't know what I don't know. Anything can happen. I am almost always with another person. I'm almost always with a photographer who I trust. That's very helpful. Or, for me, the best way to go into a community and report anyway is not just to go in and show up places where you're not invited and speak to people. It's to find somebody who's really embedded in the community, a rec center leader, a block captain, and it's to walk around with that person. So that both keeps you safe and, more importantly, I think, helps you get better sources and helps you build trust.
And I'm sure that convinces your parents anyway, so no problem.
Yeah.
More questions? I was curious also just, and maybe one of these two pieces that I just cited before is one of them, I don't know. Can you single out a story of yours that has been the toughest, the most challenging to report and write of all these within this subject area that we've been talking about? Is there one that really stands out that, boy, that was the one that really either took the longest, had the most impediments before you were able to finally post it?
Sure. So last summer, I worked with a team of reporters to write a story called Intersections of Injustice, which was about, we identified the 55 blocks in Philadelphia that had experienced 10 or more shootings in the last 5 years. So these would be the most violent blocks in Philadelphia. And we wanted to go to as many of them as we could to find out why, what was going on those blocks, what could be done to turn the tide, what did people who live on those blocks think about it. And so this was a sort of piece of data-driven reporting. We worked with an incredible data journalist who, as myself and one other reporter, were going to as many blocks as we could and talking to people on the ground. He was crunching the numbers and found that, like, a huge percent of these blocks had been redlined decades prior. So many of them had basically just experienced decades and decades of disinvestment and were in many ways set up by the system to fail, and had not seen investment, for generations. So that sort of told the data side of the story. And we wanted to find representative examples of gun violence that had happened on these blocks. And 55 blocks sounds like a lot, but it's really not. So we tried to drill down on specific shootings and try to find people who either had been shot on those blocks or they were the family members of people who had been shot on those blocks. Nearly half of the blocks were in Kensington, which is very, very difficult to report in for a variety of reasons. Some of my colleagues have done amazing work in Kensington, but given the drug trade, so many people in Kensington don't want to talk because maybe they're wrapped up in something themselves. So yeah, that story was just a real challenge. We worked on it for well over 6 months. It was really, really hard to get people to talk to us because so many of these blocks, they were like, the Inquirer has never cared about me. Why do you guys care about me now? And they were really skeptical. And so it took a ton of source cultivation to even get a few people to open up to us and to provide examples. For the story. But in the end, we found people, and it just took some time.
Yeah. So you got to get used to people either literally or figuratively slamming the door in your face.
It was a lot of literally slamming the door in my face. Yeah.
That's the other thing. It's you also have to develop a tough skin for that too. Not the persistence.
Yeah. This was a situation where I would say 9 out of 10 people we contacted said no, they don't want to participate. So that's not a very good success rate. But.
We have time for a couple more questions if anybody wants to throw in, because I have a couple if you don't. I guess one was, and I mentioned this before to you, you know, you said before, like, hey, you know, we're human beings too, but by the same token, we have to sort of work with a certain amount of journalistic, I don't know, dispassion in some ways, or else you can't function and do the work. So, nevertheless, has the violence that you've covered in any way impacted you emotionally? Has it colored the way you think about the city? Or are you able to just sort of, again, compartmentalize to some extent, you know, through the journalistic sensibility and not have you affect you emotionally?
I think yes and yes. When I am working, I am in almost all circumstances detached and not emotional. And I don't really know how I do that. It just sort of comes with the territory. When I get in like reporting mode, I am there to tell that person's story. And my emotions getting in the way of that is not making the situation better for them. I can't imagine if I was a mom who lost their son to gun violence and the reporter had the audacity to come up to me and say that they were sad. That would hurt my feelings. And so I force myself to be detached in those moments. I have come home from many assignments and completely broken down. And I don't think that makes me, you know, I don't think that makes me some sort of like subjective reporter. These things are sad and they're emotional, and young people shouldn't be dying on the streets. Yeah, it has a huge impact on me emotionally. I'm a real person, and you know, I have found some ways to cope. I have a very supportive partner. I try to have time where I don't look at my phone, don't think about it. But yeah, it has a huge impact on us emotionally, and I think it would be surprising if it didn't. You can't go to funerals for kids and not be impacted emotionally.
So, does that mean that you can sustain commitment to doing this kind of work for the foreseeable, or do you have other, I don't know, any personal journalistic goals that are beyond this particular area of coverage for yourself, longer term?
I was just saying to somebody the other day, I have no idea what I want to be when I grow up. I know I want to be a journalist, but I have no clue like what I want to cover. I have covered so many different things. You know, I've covered politics, I've covered business, I've written about food and transportation, I've covered love and dating. I've done so much. This has been by far the most fulfilling thing that I've covered, but I don't know that it's something I could do forever, but you know, again, that's one of the other cool things about journalism is we get to try so many different new things. So no long-term aspirations. I hope that people keep reading my work and that I can find new and interesting ways to have an impact, and that's pretty much my life goal.
Well, let's thank Anna for being here today.
Thank you.
The goals will, you know.
Yeah, the goals will come.
The goals will come, you know. That's how life works.
I'm just trying to make it to the end of this week.
Yeah, really. Well, it's only Monday. Anybody want to come up and say hi?
Yes,
You can
please do.
that
Thank you
too.
all for the wonderful questions.